So Mike Fell is a principal research fellow at UCL Energy Institute and a co-investigator on the UKRI Energy Demand Research Centre. His work asks who is able to participate in a flexible, decarbonised energy system and on what terms. More recently, he's been studying how AI agents might mediate people's participation in energy systems, including co-design studies of large language model preference agents, which we'll talk more about later in the week in a contributed talk as well. So please join me in welcoming Mike to tell us a bit more about energy systems.
Hi, so thanks very much for having me. Yes, my name is Mike Fell from UCL, and basically the idea for this talk, energy is one of the big topics here in this talk, and when we think about energy transitions, often, it's thinking about the technologies like solar generation, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and so on. And the point is that we've largely got the kind of technological solutions that we think are needed to, underpin the kind of this transition, and that the key challenges now in addressing, going forward through this transition are primarily social ones. So about the uptake of these technologies, how they might be used, and the impacts they have on the people who end up using them. And that if we fail to capture these kind of social aspects well in modeling, then in a sense, we're missing the most important factor. So in this talk, really, I just want to kind of make the foundation, initially with a brief kind of introduction to the energy system in general, and then some of the main different ways of thinking about it from a kind of social perspective. And then Hannah, who's going to talk afterwards, will apply that more directly to the context of modeling. And it's a bit hard to know how to pitch this because obviously there are, everyone's an expert in their different areas in this room, and some of you are energy experts and others in different areas. But even if you're not an energy expert, you might well have read up a lot and followed around it. So I hope what I say doesn't come across as like either too basic. I'm sure it won't come across as too advanced. And also, I'm not sure it's going to take me the whole session as well. So I hope, given that we've got an hour for this session, do think as you're going through, not just about kind of questions for me, but provocations that you think might come up, kind of reactions, pushback. If you want to question something I say, just make a note of things so that if and when I do finish somewhat early, we've got an opportunity to kind of discuss. And anyway, hopefully there'll be hopefully it will start to kind of prompt some connections with your own work, whatever that might be. So, I mean, you already heard David yesterday basically say this, so he's slightly kind of made the same point as me. But the key, starting point is the whole reason we have energy systems is to provide energy services. As David said, no one particularly values having some units of electricity or some liters of petrol or whatever. So energy is a sort of a derived demand in that sense. Energy services are those, those functions that we perform using energy. But again, as David said, we don't want heating just for the sake of heating. We want it to get a warm room or to melt some product in a factory. And ultimately, we want those things, to increase our comfort or health or well-being and so on. So those, are the core things I think that we need to focus on when thinking about energy from a social perspective for me. So in order to, from the starting point of meeting those service demands, then obviously, we need systems in a sense which kind of can link the sources of that energy and those demands, those uses. And we know that traditionally, certainly in since the Industrial Revolution, that's been based around burning fossil fuels, either to generate heat directly, heat or mobility directly, or sort of indirectly to generate electricity. And obviously we've been burning other fuels as well. So this is just you know, a bit of a spaghetti kind of Sankey diagram for, this is for Europe from the IEA, which I'll just kind of talk you through because I think it's a kind of useful context. So essentially what this does is breaks down looking from left to right. I mean, the first is about whether the sort of that primary energy is produced domestically or imported. So more imports for Europe, primarily because of oil. But then, yeah, when you look at where it says natural gas at the top there, this is the kind of primary energy. So the kind of the basic fuel. And you can see some of that. So if you follow along the blue line right along directly from natural gas right to the very end at the right, you'll see residential. So that's like people, you know, burning gas in their boiler at home for heating or cooking and so on. But then, you know, some of it, if you follow it as it dips down to the middle, goes to this sort of transformation layer, which is where it might be going into electricity in this case. So, you know, we still burn quite a lot of gas for electricity in the UK. But then obviously some of that electricity goes back up and kind of meets residential demands. So yeah, I mean, looking across here, we see that most of our primary production in the EU still comes from fossil sources, gas and oil, and you know, what other points was I going to make about this? Yeah, I mean, you can look at this afterwards, but it's just a good sort of representation of how things are kind of breaking down. The reason we're, yeah, go for it, yeah, sure. Aviation, that's the fuel, aviation fuels and marine fuels. So, you know, so so your track there is, you know, you've got your crude oil essentially, which then gets refined and then goes to those different fuels. So I guess one of the reasons we're primarily concerned about about energy and transitioning the energy system, although there are others which I'll mention, is greenhouse gas emissions. You know, energy use is responsible for the vast majority of those. This is another helpful figure. So, you know, a lot of it in industry, also largely in buildings, residential and commercial buildings and transport, and it dwarfs really those other sectors. So, you know, this is one of the key factors that dominate sort of my thinking about the reasons why we're transitioning in energy. But there are also really clearly other, which I haven't got slides on, but clearly other important challenges going on, which, you know, we're facing right now, the kind of the challenges of energy security in a situation where, you know, as you've seen, large part of that primary production is still coming from oil, and a large part of that is, you know, coming from the Middle East, which is kind of severely constrained at the moment, and we've seen gas price shocks as well due to the war in Ukraine. So energy security is a massive issue, and that's obviously led on to the challenges around the affordability of energy, which I'm sure everyone's experiencing. So as a kind of the key path to decarbonising the system, but also addressing some of these sort of security and affordability constraints, the sort of the primary path is seen as being electrification, I would say. I think there's pretty much agreement around that. So the logic for this is that, you know, while you can use fossil fuels in a kind of a low carbon way by introducing carbon capture and storage, it's very expensive and hasn't really been proven at scale, I would say. The idea instead is that the thing that we can decarbonize, or that can allow us to use electricity with zero carbon, is by using renewables like solar generation, wind generation, hydro, and so on, to generate electricity. And that means that it's therefore imperative that we electrify our demand. So that means in the UK, we still have at the moment about 80% of homes will burn gas for heating. That needs to transition to using. Right. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. No, go ahead. I'll carry on.
You can keep talking and I'll just do this.
You know, so if we're going to meet certainly the targets which we've got in the UK, which is a net zero by 2050, then all of those gas boilers by that point, effectively, unless you go for a little bit of offsetting for really difficult ones, will need to be electrified by installing heat pumps instead, or district heat networks that will be powered by low carbon sources. Same goes for mobility. Sorry. Same goes for mobility. We need to transition to electric vehicles, and this, of course, has implications for the system, because renewables aren't generating all the time. You need to build more of them than you would, think you would need, because they can only be used at a certain capacity, and they're more likely to be built in some places than others, both far away, like off in places where you don't have power generation so much at the moment, like offshore, but also much closer to people's homes as well. All of this creates challenges for the energy infrastructure, being able to get the energy from where it's generated and move it through the wires and the infrastructure essentially to where it's needed. And all that means that the actual infrastructure that we need, those kind of cables and substations and transformers and so on of the system, also need to change. So basically, we're looking at a system where we have potentially every house, every home and business in the country needing to change these really important technologies that they use to heat and move around, combined with the costs that potentially come with doing those infrastructure upgrades and the impacts that it has in the landscape, in towns and all the works and so on. So, and all of these things are, highly implicated. People are highly implicated in how those things happen. So just to kind of focus in a bit more detail to how we're kind of expecting the electricity systems to change, because as I highlighted, as we look forward, we see our energy service demands being met largely by electricity. The figure on the left there is the sort of traditional system, centralized system, where you have large generators, fossil fuel generators, for example, or nuclear power. Those are connected by a transmission system, which goes across the country at high voltage, and is then stepped down into the distribution network more locally, and then through different voltage layers, through different substations, that then feeds power out to the homes and businesses that use it. So that's the traditional system. If you look at the figure on the right, which is the system that we're increasingly going to, obviously we still have some of those large centralized generators, whether those are traditional kind of fossil fuel burning ones, or large offshore wind plants or solar farms, for example, that are connected to the transmission system. Increasingly, we have these small kind of rooftop PV, community PV, solar on schools and so on systems. We have energy storage that might be in homes in the form of batteries. It might be by substations at the grid level. Potentially every home having an electric vehicle that can be potentially charged up and discharged at different times. And all of that needs to be kind of coordinated, and that can be done. Well, it benefits from being coordinated, because to the extent that, let's say, for example, you've got your local distribution grid, which might be, the couple of hundred houses around where you live. If you've got lots of people with solar power and lots of people with electric demands in that area, to the extent that you can avoid sending a load of power up through that grid, to the higher up through that substation, which might be ultimately a constraint, but instead incentivize people to use it locally in that part of the grid, that can help bring down the overall cost that we need in terms of upgrading the infrastructure. So there's also this big priority on how we control and sort of manage the grid. So thinking specifically about the role of people in all this, there are many, bearing in mind that for the vast majority of people, I think it's fair to say energy and electricity is essentially, if anything, it's kind of a frustration and or a painful annoyance when you get the bill, but really it's not something that people are generally particularly interested in thinking about. But ultimately, we are going to need millions of households to adopt these new technologies and use them in certain ways. We're going to need tens or hundreds of thousands of people to work to install those technologies. which needs training and certification. We need, citizens supporting or, sometimes objecting to developments. I mentioned these infrastructure developments, like, these like high voltage power lines going through areas of natural beauty. Those are things that communities will be very important in determining whether they happen or not, or why. Experiencing its impacts. Nice misplaced apostrophe there. Sorry about that. That's going to make me feel bad. It's burning my eyes. But yeah, all of us, wherever we live, the costs of this, these transitions, but also the external shocks that happen whether or not we have transition, kind of come through in our bills. But we don't just experience the impacts of a transition through bills. My area of work, which is around what we call demand side flexibility, which is this idea that I kind of alluded to earlier, that we might want to use electricity when it's being most generated, for example, by renewables, or manage our electricity to avoid constraints on the system. That can also have impacts on the way we experience energy services, like whether we do things at some times rather than others, or whether we have certain levels of heating or cooling at some times rather than others. And I mean, I'll come to sort of some justice elements in the end, but things like whether you've got a battery at home could determine whether you're a family or a household that can still cook when you want to for your children at 6 p.m, or whether you feel you need to defer cooking until later when power is cheaper. So very much can come through to experiences as well, paying through upgrades, like I mentioned, communicating about it, whether that's in professional roles or privately, regulating. People are taking part when we're thinking about modeling and thinking about the role of policy. Ultimately, those things also come down to what can sometimes be decisions made for kind of personal reasons, or reasons made on the basis of personal kind of rationalizations. So kind of many different roles and many more that people potentially have in the system. So what I want to do now is just kind of give a bit of an overview of a few of the kind of the key lenses, I suppose, through which researchers working in energy, social researchers, characterize or think about the social. And I'm going to focus specifically, because it's kind of a tangible example, mostly on the case of acquiring and using low carbon technology, like heat pumps, for example. Because this is obviously an important determining factor in the speed of the transition, and where exactly, how it gets distributed, where we see it happening and where we don't, and so on, how its impacts might be. And it's also important, when we're thinking about how these technologies might be ultimately used. So, and apologies in advance to any specialists in these individual disciplines who feel that these are kind of reductive descriptions. I want to kind of encourage people to kind of add more or problematize these as we go through. So I think probably one of the dominant approaches has been, coming from an economics perspective, with the central idea being that individuals are making rational choices to maximize their own utility, essentially subject to constraints. So this means that when a household or business is considering adopting a low carbon technology, this will involve consideration of what the costs might be, what the savings might be, other aspects of its performance that might be kind of given a kind of a monetary value and factored in. And therefore, seen through this lens, the sorts of responses in terms of how we might encourage or direct uptake of these technologies, is looked at, from the perspective of what prices we might ultimately come through to the market through subsidies and taxes and incentives and so on. And there are these different methods, and Hannah, I think will probably touch a bit on this in her talk, in which these can be kind of captured in models. I mean, the reason why this has been so dominant, I would say, as well as having a lot of sense to it, naturally, I'm aware of the economists in the room, is that it is tractable in quantitative models. These are things that can be measured, for better or worse, that can be observed relatively easily. But we're all aware of some of the kind of the drawbacks, you know, and we'll come on to this around, you know, the idea that people do have these kind of sort of set preferences that, you know, they can put a monetary value on, and that they can make appropriate assessments of that exact kind of value, what it might be. You know, so just to give an example of the kind of way this thought process might work, let's say that I'm a person living in a big house in the country, and I've got an oil-based boiler, which is, you know, it's getting a bit old, it's maybe showing some problems that stopped working. So I've got a choice. I can either fix my oil boiler, which might be a few £100, let's say, in the short term, but then I've got this potentially higher or uncertain cost going forward. Or I can decide to switch to a heat pump, which might be quite a large expense up front, but then depending on other factors, you know, if I've got my own solar panels or whatever, I might have low future costs. And in this case, you know, my thought process, or my rational economic thought process, would be, what essentially is the value to me now of those savings combined with those outgoings? And I might attach some discount rate, so I might think of savings in the future as not being worth quite as much as they are now, but ultimately I would make a balance between those two and come up with the one that ultimately gives me the lowest cost outcome. So that would be the sort of thought process involved in whether to get a heat pump or not. And that's why in the UK, you know, we've got like a £7,500 subsidy at the moment to bring down that upfront cost and make that calculation more favourable for people. So behavioural approaches, here, we're not disregarding the importance of prices and costs and benefits and so on, but here we're bringing much more consideration to, you know, a wider range of factors, like what kind of prior beliefs we might have, what existing habits we've got, kind of heuristics or kind of shortcuts that we might make. So instead of making detailed calculations, you know, what kind of rules of thumb do we have in our heads that might help us make decisions? What kind of biases do we have? So like David said yesterday, it's a bit of it has got negative connotations, but essentially what are those ways in which the way people make decisions, how do they deviate from what kind of economic rationality might expect? You know, and our emotions and how we perceive risks and how much we trust those making the offers to us and so on. All of these are factors that, you know, behavioral approaches will consider. And, you know, like I showed earlier, people aren't, you know, some people, maybe people like me are, but some people aren't sitting down with spreadsheets and making these kind of spending a lot of time making carefully thought through calculations. Often these are decisions that are being made, you know, on the go, with limited information, limited time, and so on. So behavioral approaches are paying more attention to these factors. You know, all that means that even though you might have two households facing exactly the same set of economic circumstances and the same sort of decision, you know, they might end up in very different positions. So here, you know, the policy implications of this, you know, are more thinking about, you know, how defaults, you know, what just happens if people don't make an active choice? What sorts of information are being provided by policy actors, the government, or other actors, partners, who's in, you know, what sort of trusted partners are involved in communicating? And this idea of nudges, which people have probably come across, this idea that, you know, people are having to make choices all the time, and those choices have to come with some kind of framing to them, you know, whether opt in or opt out. And it's about architecting that choice to never force people to make a certain decision. People have got the choice to do whatever they want, but to using kind of behavioral theory to make it more likely that people will make a decision which is maybe either good, better for them, for their health, or for society, and so on. So not uncontroversial, but that's the idea. So, you know, this can help us explain observations which depart from that sort of you know, the classical economic approach. But, you know, we are still working in a paradigm where individuals are the main kind of unit of analysis, and it can be, you know, less able to see the role of kind of structural factors, you know, broader sort of social factors, which is the kind of domain of sociology, which I'll kind of come on to in a second. So, I mean, look, I'm just going to show a few kind of quick examples of the sorts of models which you use here. This is a pretty old one. This is the theory of planned behavior. But it's something that you still see used quite a lot now. So this, this suggests that people's ultimate behavior, so in this case, at the far right there, heat pump installation, is sort of determined or preceded by a behavioral intention. So someone kind of intending to do something. So that will cause or lead to a behavior. And that behavioral attention is directed by, these factors like an attitude to thinking that it would be good to have a heat pump, for example. And subjective norms, which is, an assessment based on, what others might think or what it is perceived as being the right thing to do. And also this idea of control, is installing a heat pump something which would be within your control to do? Can I find an installer? Do I have the legal right to install a heat pump in my property? So these would be the factors that you would be looking to understand and collect data on if you wanted to apply a model like this. And then I mentioned these biases. So this is probably one of the best widely known and discussed, this idea of loss aversion. So, typically you would expect £100 gain or £100 saving, let's say, to be kind of weighted equally. But we know empirically that gains tend to be weighted less than losses. People are more concerned about losses than they are kind of enthused about gains. So this means that, you might end up deciding that in promoting something like a time of use tariff, so this is work by a colleague of mine, you might frame that more in terms of the money that someone might stand to miss out on if they don't go into the time of use tariff, or that they would kind of gain by going onto it. And this sort of the intervention worked in the case of this experiment. It was shown that like framings that highlighted loss were more impactful in terms of getting people to say they would switch. And I partly just put this up here because of the sort of nostalgic nature of seeing the word emoticons. But this was basically, a study that kind of on energy bills communicating. It was trying to use sort of social norms approaches, saying how people are doing relative to their neighbours. So they would get their bill and say, here's your bill, and relative to your neighbours, you're much better or you're much worse. I mean, words to that effect. But when that was done, it was found that while the people who were not as good as their neighbours, let's say, saved more energy, the people who were performing better in terms of energy saving than their neighbours actually kind of got worse, because they were like, oh, I could be using more energy. I'm a sucker, So then what they did was, I mean, in this study, this is just one study, they kind of, for the kind of you're doing better than your neighbours, they tested like putting this kind of smiley emoji on it, or you're doing worse, the negative one. So it was kind of, you're doing better than them, and that's a good thing. Like we endorse it. And that, according to this study, did result in people maintaining their kind of better performance. I think these are all kind of relatively small and quite up and down sort of measures, but it just kind of illustrates the kinds of interventions that people look at. And clearly putting a smiley or a whatever emoji on a bill basically costs nothing. So these are often kind of low cost interventions, and that's why they're of interest. And they're people see them as being fairly kind of liberal. You're not telling people what to do, you're just giving people information. So finally, so we've talked about economics and kind of behavioral approaches. The final kind of main class, I mean, look, there will be others, different disciplines who bring their understandings to this area, but just in the time available, I wanted to focus on these, are sociological approaches. So here, I would say in energy studies, probably the main shift has been, instead of focusing on individuals, so you and me, people, and how we make decisions, instead paying attention to social practices or social relations and looking at those as the kind of unit of analysis. So a social practice, might be something like laundry, and the different ways in which the practice of laundry is performed in different households and different places, and why that might be, and what shapes that, and what that means for the patterns of electricity use. And, a practice theorist or a sociologist's understanding of technology uptake would be affected by that. It would pay attention to the fact that these kind of structural factors the ways in which technologies might hold meanings or fit into people's lives in different ways, and their wider patterns of practices, that those things all have a strong impact in something like technology adoption. Like I said, patterns of energy demand emerge from how these practices are organized. And, the point is as well, everything we do, can be conceptualized as social practice, and they all shape each other to some extent, in the sense that, we work at certain times, and that means that we can or can't be eating certain kinds of food at certain times, or doing certain kinds of childcare at certain times. And these things all kind of have to fit around and negotiate with each other. So, this approach does bring attention to these kind of rather structural and systemic drivers. But as you can sort of tell from the way I'm describing it, it can be kind of harder to maybe capture and measure. It's maybe things that aren't as easy either to observe in price data like economics, or to ask people in a survey, although you can. So, we tend to see more focus on qualitative work in this area as a rule, I would say. And maybe that can make it more difficult to incorporate into modeling. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts on that. So, I mean, just to kind of talk through one example with another low carbon technology, but this is a bit of an older technology, which is the bike. So, it might seem like a simple decision. Should someone get a bike and use it for riding around to work instead of getting a car or something like that? But in order to be in that position, there are important kind of skills for a start that someone might have to have, like being able to ride with confidence in traffic. Probably now, do basic repairs on a bike is still quite important. Being able to do that, and being able to actually know how you can get around. I'll talk about the materials one now. I mean, it mentions here, connected with that sense of riding with confidence, that might be determined by whether there are kind of safe cycle routes that you can follow. A bike that functions, have you got trousers that aren't going to get caught in the spokes? Changing facilities at work. I mean, my big one on my bike was I didn't have one of those things where you can clip your phone to your handlebars, so that meant I have to keep stopping to get my phone out when I'm trying to navigate. And it's like, just a simple thing like that can make the idea of getting around on your bike much more easy. And then, the meanings that cycling might have. Is this something that someone's seeing as well, I can't afford to get a car or get the bus, I've got this secondhand bike that I need to ride to work, it's a necessity? Or is someone seeing it as a choice for health reasons, for example? Are they someone who's going out on the weekends as well and kind of riding with a big group of lycra-clad guys, or going out with their family for bike rides? Is it fun? Do they enjoy it? So all of these factors that you can think about ways of capturing, but are really important determinants in whether ultimately more or less people end up taking part in this practice of cycling, and why and when. I think you can really usefully start to navigate in these ways, and it starts to draw your mind to the sorts of factors you can change to encourage or discourage behavior. We look at the material side. Our council is going to install cycle routes on certain ways. What do companies say about their dress codes and so on? Are they having places people can get changed at work? All of these things might make it more easy or more difficult for people to adopt cycling as a practice, but they wouldn't emerge naturally from a sense that, from one of those other perspectives. Either, they might think instead, economics approach might say we need a cycle to work scheme, which means that people can get access to a bike more affordably through offsetting against their wages. Or, the behavioural approach might be about ways in which we communicate the benefits of the health benefits or something. But I think the point is, all of these approaches together, I think, can provide quite an enriching way of thinking about the role of people and behaviour in the context of energy. And they can, I think, all in the right way have been shown to be tractable in the context of modeling, and bring kind of different insights. So, and again, it's like David was saying yesterday, it's about picking and very carefully choosing what it is that you want to bring that lens in the model onto. And I just wanted to finish by talking about the question of justice. So in a sense, in this talk so far, maybe I've been framing people a little bit as sort of instrumental in the context of transitions. I've been sort of saying we need to have a low carbon transition because we're worried about, you know, the effects of climate change, or we're worried about energy security and so on, and that people, you know, have a role in enabling that big kind of thing to happen. But we also know clearly that all of us, for different reasons, have different experiences of kind of being impacted by our use of energy and energy system change, whether that's in costs or the ways we, you know, experience energy services, like I mentioned, or mining operations near us, or infrastructure being built near us, and so on. And those factors, which, you know, those things all might come to us differently as a result of where we live, what our health status is, what our financial resources are, you know, how much we can afford to pick up like an increase in bills, or what buildings we live in. You know, many of these things are kind of hard to change. So whether a family or a household is living in fuel poverty, which means essentially they're struggling to pay their energy bills, is likely to be, you know, not just a result of how rich or poor they are, although that's important, but these things like building characteristics. And a household in fuel poverty might be, you know, worse impacted if they've got health issues, or they might be more likely to find themselves in that situation because they've got health issues. So that question of, you know, justice, I think, is a really important one to bear in mind as well and think about. There are different ways of thinking about fairness and equity and questions of justice and energy, but I mean, one of the dominant ones is through this kind of energy justice approach, which sort of envisages sort of three elements. So there's the distributional justice, which is kind of what I was talking about there, which is how the impacts or benefits fall on different groups in society, how and why. And then there's recognition justice, which is about actually paying attention to and recognizing those different needs that different groups might have. And then the procedural angle, which is how people are involved in the processes of, you know, decision making ultimately around what happens. And that's also something that increasingly is being brought out through modeling, trying to capture those factors. So yeah, in summary, as you heard yesterday, and as I said, really, I think the first thing to remember is that the energy system exists for us. I mean, you might say there are also other interests. The energy system exists to generate profits for private companies and generate work for people as well. But I think its primary goal, its sort of telos, is to provide the services to let us do the things we want to do. And that people, because for that reason, are a kind of a core driver in it. They're sort of central to it in terms of how they adopt and use technology, how they oversee it and are impacted by it. I've talked about these different lenses, you know, economic, behavioral and sociological approaches, and the sort of different insights that they can bring, and the different sort of maybe weaknesses and strengths that they each have. And yeah, that just, we have got quite a rich menu when it comes to thinking about how we move forward with modeling the role of people in this area. And yeah, I'll be interested to see how people take some of that forward, and well, what Hannah's got to say as well, and to discuss it with you now. So yeah, if anyone's got any questions or observations, or wants to push back or just raise any points for discussion, I think we've still got about 20 minutes or so for this session. So yeah, please do. But yeah, thank you.